right, so here we go. In your notes, let's write the following definition for midpoint. Let's put down that the midpoint is the point, because it is a point. It's not a line. It's not a ray. It's not a plane. The midpoint is a point that, so the point that divides the segment into two congruent segments. Okay. All right. So now we've got a formula for finding the midpoint. Do you need to memorize these formulas? Yes, you do need to memorize these formulas. Okay. It's not a very hard formula. It looks complicated, but it really isn't. So we're going to use a capital M to represent our midpoint. And it's going to be equal to, now that's an x with a subscript of 1. So I'm going to say x sub 1 plus x sub 2. And that is all over 2 with a comma in between. Y sub 1 plus y sub 2 all over 2. Parentheses around that whole entire thing. All right, so now let's think. We know how to copy a line segment. We know how to find the midpoint of that segment. We did it yesterday. So now what happens if our line segment gets placed into a coordinate grid? Or what if a coordinate grid gets overlaid on top of the line segment that we drew? We now have coordinate points, or an ordered pair that represents a point, right? Number 20 on your quiz, you had to plot points and then find the length of those line segments. So an ordered pair has an x value and a y value. So how do we find the x and the y value of a midpoint? Well, we add the two x values of the 2 points given and divide it in half. How do we find the middle of something? We add them together and divide by 2. What's the middle of 3 and 7? Make a number line. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. What number would be in the middle of 3 and 7?
5.
5. Is it true if you add 3 and 7 and divide it by 2, you get 5? Yeah, right? Because to get to 5, that's 2 units away. To get to 5 from 3, that's 2 units away. Okay? So if I add my two coordinates together, 3 plus 7, and divide it by 2, I'm going to get the middle. Right? Okay. All right. So now, moving away from midpoint, we're going to add in the idea of a segment bisector. So remember, a midpoint is a point. But what if our point is no longer a point and it turns into a line segment, or it turns into a line, or it turns into a ray? So here for our definition for segment bisector is a point, ray, line, or plane that intersects the segment at its midpoint. Okay, so a point, ray, line segment, or a plane. We don't really see the plane too often. That intersects the segment at its midpoint. So, some examples. Let's go ahead and make a line segment. Let's call it line segment AB. Really quickly, why would we never be able to find the midpoint of a line? yeah, it doesn't have endpoints, so there really is technically no middle, right? Because it goes on and on forever. So we can only bisect a line segment, hence why it's called a segment bisector. You can only bisect a segment. All right, so let's eyeball where you think the midpoint would be. Let's label it M. You technically could find it if we pulled out those compasses and make an arc, right? Arc, find the middle. Good. All right, so if that's my midpoint, let's go ahead and make our segment bisector being a line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line going through the midpoint. That would be a segment bisector. The biggest thing you need to worry about is if you hear the word bisect, that means it's cutting it into two equal parts. Where then would be my two equal parts? Well, it would be AM and MB. What do those little tick marks mean again? Congruent, right? So that means that AM is congruent to MB, which means that they're the same length, right? All right, so we've got that. So bisect, midpoint kind of does the same thing. So here's our first example. We have line segment VW, and I know my diagram, it does not look like it is bisecting it, but we're going to pretend. VW bisects at point T, and XT equals 39.9 centimeters. Find XY. All right, so if it's bisecting at T, that means this has to be congruent to this. XT needs to be congruent to TY. Again, I know it doesn't look like that. It's a bad diagram. My bad. But we're going to pretend that it is the same. So if XT is 39.9 centimeters, I'm going to label that. What would TY need to be if they're congruent? 39.9 centimeters. Good. So then what would be the length of the whole thing? 39.9 plus 39.9. Don't worry, I'll help you out. I know it's early in the morning. 79.8. So XY is equal to 79.8 centimeters. Okay? So if you hear the word bisect or midpoint, you should be thinking that you're going to have two congruent parts. And what does it mean when you have two congruent parts? That means you've got two equal measures. Okay? Questions with that one? All right. Next one. Now it's telling us that point M is the midpoint of line segment VW. Find the length of VM. Well, if the whole thing is 46, and M is the midpoint, which means it divides it into two congruent parts, what would be the length of each of those parts? Yep, how'd you get that, Jackson? Divide it by 2. So half of 20, or 46 is 23. So VM is equal to 23. Okay, so far so good. Now can we throw some algebra into our lives? Anthony says, yes, please. I would love to have some more algebra in my life. Okay, so now this kind of looks similar to what we did on our quiz with the algebra problems with segment addition. But now what's different? Do they tell us the whole entire length from V to W? No. So your gut instinct would be to do this. Don't do this on your notes, just watch. Your gut instinct would be, oh, I remember these problems. I should add 3x minus 1 plus 20 together. But then I don't have anything to equal it to it, right? Don't try to equal it to the sum again. That's not going to work out. So we're solving for x. Yes, both sides would be 20. You are correct. So if this is 20, like Connor is saying, because M is a midpoint, then that means this is also 20. So what's my equation going to be? Yeah, perfect. So 3x minus 1 equals 20. So ultimately what you're doing is you're just equaling the left to the right. right? So add your 1 over. So plus 1 to both sides. 3x equals 21. Next move would be to divide out the 3. So x is equal to 7. Let's reread the directions. Am I done? Is that what I'm asked to find? Well, we could plug it in, but then I would just get 20 again, right? So that's a good way to check to make sure you did do it right. But the problem is just asking us to solve for x. So we're done. Okay? All right, so difference between segment addition and midpoint. Here you're given midpoint in the directions. So that means you're probably going to set the left equal to the right. In segment addition, you're not given a midpoint, so that is where you have to add them together and equal it to the whole. Two different problems, don't confuse them. All right, now let's get the formula involved. So now we have to find the coordinates of the midpoint of points R and S. Okay? Now, you do not need to be required to do this every time, but I'm going to suggest that you do this off to the side so that you can kind of see and visualize what's going on. So just make a quick rough graph off to the right. And let's plot those points. So point R is at 1, -3. So can you put a point R at 1, -3 and label it R? And S is at 4, 2, so 1, 2, 3, 4, up to, label it S. Connect them to turn into a line segment. All right, now if you had to take a guess, where do you think the midpoint would be? So at 3, 0?
Yeah.
So like right here?
Yeah.
I'd say it's probably down a little bit. I'm going to guess maybe like right about here. Maybe? All right, so how can we get it to be exactly the midpoint? We would use the midpoint formula. Okay, well what is our midpoint formula? We wrote it at the top of our page. So to find the midpoint, we're going to add our x's. Do we do sub 1 or sub 2 first? Sub 1, so x sub 1 plus x sub 2 all over 2, comma, y sub 1 plus y sub 2 all over 2, comma. Okay. Well, out of those two coordinates, which numbers are the x's? 1 and 4. Good. Doesn't matter which one you make 1 or 2, which one you do first. You'll get the same answer no matter what. So if we do 1 plus 4 and then divide it by 2, okay, if it helps, put little xy's above your points so you remember which ones are the x and which ones are the y's. Common error, sometimes students will add these two together and divide by 2. Instead of taking the x from here and the x from here, they'll just do the x and the y in one set. So they would do 1 plus -3. That's not correct. Okay, what are my y coordinates of those 2 points? -3 and 2 divided by 2. Okay, so now let's simplify. 1 plus 4 is 5. 5 divided by 2 is 2.5. Okay, so 2.5, or if you want to write it as a fraction, 5 over 2, or if you want to write it as 2 1/2, however you want to write it, it's fine with me. Comma, -3 plus 2 is -1 divided by 2 is -1/2. Yeah, I've got a decimal and a fraction. I'm getting crazy. All right, now let's look at the point that I eyeballed. 2 1/2 would be over here, down 1/2. Was I pretty close? Yeah. Okay. Now, on a problem like this, you do not need to graph it. Don't graph it. I just wanted you guys to visualize what was going on. All you will have to do is just use the formula. So my final answer is the ordered pair, 2.5 comma -1/2. Okay? Now, how would you do it in reverse? This is going to be the trickiest problem of this section. How would we do it in reverse? What if I gave you a midpoint, and I gave you an endpoint, how would you then find the other endpoint?
Instead of adding them, would you subtract?
You would eventually need to subtract, yep. But let's think about it. You're on the right track, but let's think about it graphically, because I think that's the easiest way to do it. What should be true about this yellow point to S? Do you guys remember slope, rise, and run? Wouldn't it be true, now watch over here on my graph, wouldn't it be true that my rise over run in this direction should be the same as or just the opposite, rise over run in that direction? Yeah? So if we graph it, couldn't I just count units and then count units backwards? And it should get me there? All right, so let's do it that way first, because I think that's technically the easiest. Then I can show you how to do it algebraically, like what Maddie is saying. All right, so let's make a quick graph here off to the right. Coordinate graph 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, so they're telling us that A is the midpoint of line segment CT. If the coordinate for C is -3, 8, oops, I didn't do enough. So -3, 8, that means I need to go up more lines. So 5, 6, 7, 8, there we go. -3, 8, so over to the right, left 3, sorry, and then up 8. Puts my C way up there. Okay. A is at 4, 2. So plot 4, 2. A. So that is your midpoint. So connect those two lines. If A is the midpoint, that means it needs to be the middle of my line segment. Do you see how the other end of my line segment would probably end up somewhere out here? Okay. Well, how can I figure out where that somewhere out here is going to be? Yeah. So, how many units do we go down? So make your little right triangle. Remember doing slope, you make like that little right triangle there? Where the line is your hypotenuse. You got that, Connor? I guess mine shifted a little bit here. I need to make sure I'm down at 3 and 2. All right, so how many units are we going down from 8 to 2?
4. 6.
Yep, so from 8 to 2. So remember your rise is the change in your y, right? So what are the changes in my y? 8 and 2. So like Maddie said, what operation did she say you should use? Subtraction. Didn't we just kind of subtract there? Okay. Now how many units over are we going from -3 to 4? From -3 to 4 is how many units? It is, right? Because 1, 2, 3 plus another 4 would make 7. All right. So now let's do the same thing going down this way. Can we do that again? So if I start at A and I have to go down 6 units, well, from here to here was how many? Connor, how many units from A to the x-axis did we do? 2. So that means I need to go down how many more to get 6? 4, right? So that puts me at -4. And I have to go over how many? 7. So that puts me at what number here? If we are starting at, this was at 4. 4 plus 7 means we're going over to 11, right? Because 7 plus 4 is 11. So what would be the ordered pair of this point if my movement is over to 11 and my down movement is to -4? It would be 11, -4, right? All right, so our answer is 11, negative 4. Now, how do we get there algebraically? Because maybe you're not a graphical person and you'd rather just do the math instead of doing the graphing part. So the second option, if you don't like that, would be to set up your equation. Okay? Now let's think about this. We said to find the x-coordinate of our midpoint, we add our x's together and divide by 2. That would get me my x-coordinate of my midpoint. Yeah? Okay. Well, I already have my x-coordinate of my midpoint. What is my x-coordinate of my midpoint? It is 4. So I'm going to plug in 4 in place of my m equals. Now what's my x-coordinate of one of my endpoints? Negative 3 plus our unknown x divided by 2. I'm just going to drop the subscript. If you want to keep it, feel free. How do you solve that equation? Multiply by 2 on both sides. I like that idea. So that cancels out my 2's here. Then I'm just left with the numerator of negative 3 plus x equals 8. What's my last move? Add 3. What do I get? 11 for my x. Didn't we get 11 for our x here? We did. So then, using that same process for the y, what would our equation look like? What is my y-coordinate for the midpoint? So here's my midpoint. A is the midpoint. So my y-coordinate is 2 equals, what's my y-coordinate here? 8 plus y cut in half. So solve that the same way that we solved the other one. Multiply by 2 on both sides. Gets us 4 equals 8 plus y. When you subtract 8 from both sides, what do you get? Negative 4, which is what we had for our answer there. So then my final work would then be to put it as an ordered pair for my answer. So you can either do it algebraically. Okay, me personally thinks it's easier just to quickly make a graph and then do my rise over the run twice to get there, but that's up to you. All right, so before we move on to the back side, we are going to do some practice problems.